Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and it looks like Assassination Rogue is back on the rise when it comes to Season 2 Mythic Plus dungeon content, with a brand new build that have actually been unearthed somewhat recently. A bleed-focused Assassination build that's super thematic, transforming this roguish spec into essentially an Affliction Warlock with a couple of daggers, with massive bleed damage, fantastic AoE output, and I actually think this build is a lot easier to play for new players or players that haven't played Assassination but been looking to come back to the spec for a while, especially if you're a big fan of AoE and dungeon content. This is a brand new build, so it's not like you're seeing everybody switching through this one just yet, but I have noticed a handful of rogues trying to get this one to go in some of the high-end dungeons and actually seeing some decent results. So this made me want to give this build a proper try earlier yesterday, and I actually kind of fell in love with it. It is a much easier to get into, less cooldown heavy assassination that ends up cranking those bleeds up to an 11. Had an absolute blast playing with this one, and I kind of want to dive into this little showcase as soon as possible. But as always, if you guys want to see more class showcases like these or even rogue guides in the future, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right in. So if you haven't been paying attention lately to the Mythic Plus meta, ever since Outlaw Rogue gets snipped a little bit with the coup de grace thing that they were doing with Trickster, it looks like Assassination has been rising slowly but surely. Of course, many rogues have defaulted to the Kingsbane build, which is fine, it works out. But a new build has been discovered recently. It piqued my interest, made me want to give it a go, and the damage it can output is actually kind of surprising, making it worth covering in this video. So this is the actual build. It is the Assassination quintessential bleeds build that isn't nearly as cooldown heavy as the other build, offering some surprisingly good AoE damage, utilizing the handful of talents that got buffed up for the patch 11.1 Season 2 content. Rogues notoriously were one of the few classes that barely got any changes for the season, but we somehow still found a way to be somewhat viable. Maybe not in raids, which is where we saw rogues really falling off, especially during the race to World First. But in dungeons, in PvP, rogues are somehow still trucking along little by little. And this was something we were worried about initially, like, wait a second, everybody's getting new talents, hero talent revamps, everybody's getting new toys. Well, rogue is definitely going to be falling behind then. It felt like kind of like a remake of Season 2 of Dragonflight, where rogues definitely fell behind and then had to be brought back up for a third season. However, Assassination, it still seems to be doing just fine. It actually becoming slowly a little bit more popular than Outlaw, at least when it comes to some of the higher key pushes. Some of the talents we're going to be utilizing for this build to really fully maximize the effectiveness of this bleed bonanza is going to be Artillery Precision. This talent now hits more targets than in the previous patch. There's maybe like a 5 target cleave, but now it hits 7 additional targets, which makes it kind of good in AoE. And with the extra bleed damage effectiveness and the poison effectiveness that it has when it strikes all those nearby enemies, plus the comp points you can generate, because per target hit for every one of those crits, that's an additional comp point that you can generate. It actually becomes really good in AoE content, and with us leaning heavily into bleeds, it kind of gets to work side by side with the other talent that's core to this build, and that is Sudden Demise, a very popular pick that we've been using for last season, this season, that what also causes our bleeds to have this execute effect, which is really cool, but we primarily use it because they increased our bleed damage by 10%. They've increased it to 15 this time around, and that is enough to combine together with our tier set. The extra bleed damage together with Artillery Precision creates a very strong combo in AoE content. Whether we're talking about large form AoE where you're pulling a bunch of mobs all over the place, or if you pulling a smaller groups of enemies like in dungeons like Theater of Pain, where you're kind of limited by your pull count, but allows Assassination to have a little bit of this easy, flowy setup for your bleeds, scaling and continuing to cleave things around you, which is actually pretty solid. You do, however, give up on this build some significant amount of single target damage, so things like Kingsbane, which we are super close to, you know, just using it constantly with every single build. Surprisingly, taking us out of your rotation does feel very weird, because it feels like the spec is so heavily tied to Kingsbane. We're also not benefiting from double poisons through Dragon Temper Blades, allowing us to dip in together into Deadly Poison. and amplifying poison to buff the damage of our envenom. So you are limited on how much overall raw single target damage you are going to be putting out there. The only way to really deal additional damage outside of like a death mark is proper uses of Shiv, which with improved Shiv increase the amount of nature damage targets take by 8%. That Shiv cleaves to multiple targets, causing those bleeds to be even more effective, and you'll have 2 charges of Shiv. So now it really comes down to trying to find good moments where you want to min-max that Shiv. Normally we throw our Shivs together with Kingsbane, which is super normal and natural for most rogues if you've been playing for a while, but now you have to do dry Shivs, which is Shivs without any buffs like Kingsbane. There are a number of buffs that we do get to utilize with Shiv, and we do amplify through Shiv, but the usage of it is a little bit more flexible. It is a little bit more floaty. As part of this build, we're still playing Deathstalker. This is still the best option for Assassination when it comes to your overall build for Mythic Plus and even ratings. This continues to be a very strong options for PvE content. And we, for the most part, will run the same talents that we usually run when it comes to your Mythic Plus setups with Shadewalker, Lingering Darkness, but we do make a slight switch over into Follow the Blood, especially in Mythic Plus dungeons. With Follow the Blood, Phantom Knights and Crimson Tempest actually deal more damage, specifically Crimson Tempest, which is what we care about, whenever we have 2 or more targets affected by a rupture. This offers a significant bit of single target damage and cleave damage. Like if let's say there's a secondary target that you can like rupture just to enable this buff, that makes your Crimson Tempest better, which we actually use Crimson Tempest even in single target situations. So being able to bleed more than one target is incredibly good for our priority damage, but also our overall AoE damage, which is a little bit surprising. Mostly because this whole bleed build is enabled by our tier set. You have abilities, have a chance to gain your buff of Winning Streak, increasing the damage of your next Envenom, Rupture, Crimson Tempest, or not the next Envenom, but rather all your Envenoms while the buff is active, by 3%, stack it up to 10 times, and those abilities of Envenom, Rupture, and Crimson Tempest have a chance to remove the Winning Streak. The 4th set is where it gets really outlaw roll the bonesy. Whenever you would lose Winning Streak, you have a chance to instead gain maximum stacks of Winning Streak for 4 seconds. Those cannot be removed, and you'll have 50% additional effectiveness while immune to its removal. So basically every time you Rupture, Envenom, or Crimson Tempest, you have a chance just to lose this buff that you've been building up. Sometimes the buff doesn't get lost, and in fact it actually gets a little stronger, but eventually you will lose that buff. It is one of my least favorite tier sets because it's very passive. You can't really play around with it. I really would have wished there was some kind of like a core button like Shiv or something that allowed you to benefit from your Winning Streak stacks, or maybe lock in that buff, or do something like give you more stacks as soon as you use it. Something, anything to really spice it up. But it does make the damage of the Ruptures and Crimson Tempest significant enough with a decent enough uptime to make this bleed build work. So it's one of those tier sets that I didn't enjoy up until now, because now it enables you to build a full bleed damage to deal significant bit of AoE damage within Mythic Plus dungeons. Before we get to the good part of this build, I do want to go over some of the other setups. So tier set is going to be required in order to make this setup work. As for stats, it will be the same stat priority that you've had always. Check out our Discord channel, link down in the description below, if you want to get the basic Assassination guide, or even some of the modifications for this build specifically. But basically everything that you learned as Assassination for Season 1 carries over into Season 2. Mastery is one of your best secondary stats, followed by Crit for resources since it allows you to generate more combo points, but also more damage. Haste is not as good as it was in the previous expansion, so it's not one we invest heavily into. Neither is Versatility, unless you're looking for a little bit extra defense within Mythic Plus dungeons, and you may actually prioritize the stat a little bit more if you end up pushing some of the more high-end content. That defensiveness feels really noticeable, like switching between Outlaw, which is verse heavy, to Assassination. You really notice how much damage you start to take. As for gear, there's only a number of things that you really need. One is a 2-minute trinket. Signature Parry ends up being a very good option. If you do get House of Cards, well, best of luck if you do end up getting one from the raid. But if you get House of Cards, that also lines up pretty well. But Signet, I feel like, just ends up giving you just a better duration and overall better damage output to line up together with your death mark, because both of them are 2 minutes and they synergize together a lot better. Outside of that, you basically try to get as much gear with critical strike and mastery as much as possible. Now let's go over the fun part, the actual rotation. And essentially it's the same basic Assassination rotation as before. So if you're more or less familiar with the spec, it doesn't change too much, but certain priorities do get adjusted. As a spec, for the most part, you are still trying to maintain Rupture and Garrote on your target to deal bleed damage, but also to regain energy. Building common points with Mutilate on 3 targets or less, and Phantomizing only on 4 targets and above. Assassinate is easily maintained through Envenoms, which becomes the finisher that you want to use whenever you don't need to refresh Rupture or Garrote. However, even in single target, for this build, Crimson Tempest actually will take priority over Envenom, mostly because it gets benefits from your tier set, and makes it more than worth the while to put up this additional bleed before refreshing Envenom on the enemy target. So put up all your bleeds, all 3 of them, before you spend comp points on an Envenom. The only time that changes is when Darkest Night is proccing from Deathstalker playstyle, where you want to use that Envenom with full combo points as early as possible to reapply Deathstalker's marks or back into your target. Outside of that, bleeds will always be in priority of your Envenom, which is really weird, especially in single target, but once you play around with it a little bit, it does become kinda nice to play into. This build, with your tier set and with the Follow the Blood, is heavily encouraged to spread those Ruptures on as many targets as possible. Garrotes could also be spread, but Rupture is the dot that you really want to try to apply on as many targets as you can, because it deals significant amount of raw bleed damage, which synergizes together really well with the damage that it amplifies for your Crimson Tempest as well. There's a lot of bleed synergy to utilize here, and the more enemies you can spread your bleeds onto in AoE content in particular, the merrier. That's essentially the only big change you want to make, is to start bleeding enemies as frivolously as possible and becoming a fully dot-based rogue build, which is super fun to play into within Mythic Plus dungeons. Outside of this, the only other thing you really gotta adjust is the ability of Shiv thanks to Artillery Precision. Because Shiv no longer can be synergized together with Kingsbane, we gotta find other uses for the ability of Shiv, and this is what I found with it so far after playing around with the build. Shiv, without Kingsbane, you can start use a little bit more aggressively since you have 2 charges of the ability, especially in AoE, because it enables your bleeds and poisons to be a lot more effective. Once you have all the enemies blood up, Shiv, and then continue to use Envenom for that spatter damage in order to deal additional cleave damage while focusing down a priority target. Shiv should also be used together with Deathmark as well as multiple Envenoms inside of your big cooldown window. Shiv could also be used with the buff of Lingering Darkness, which follows a Deathmark expiration for 30 seconds, so that's yet another window where Shiv can be used freely. You could also pre-Shiv the target before you hit him with the Darkest Night, which will amplify the damage of your Envenom, but if the target is also hit with Spatter, which will cause that Envenom to cleave to multiple targets, pre-shiving allows you to apply a shiv to all targets near you, also increasing the nature damage to take from your caustic Spatter, so it becomes a very decent combo to put together. Shiv, because of Zoldic's recipe, your poisons and bleeds deal additional damage when targets are below 35% health. So when a boss or an enemy drops super low, you can Shiv to add additional extra bleed and poison damage to the targets all around you, so it becomes very strong in those execute windows. Shiv can also be saved for damage windows when a boss starts to take additional damage. So take the boss of either the last boss of Rookery. Once you break his shield, the boss roars out and then has like a vulnerability window where they take additional damage and get trucked. This is where the best time for you to send your cooldowns into the boss. You should save at least a charge of Shiv for that window every single time. Or like the first boss of Motherload, after you kick the balls into the boss and they get an invulnerability window, that's also another window for you to get some shivs in there as well. In the Dungeon of Floodgate, Big Mama also has another vulnerability window, so you can wait until the ads are dead, then she goes into this big channel window and you can just shiv into that window and deal as much damage as humanly possible. I guess there's also the ads from Azarok too. Those ads where he empowers, when they get empowered, they also take additional damage. Also another good window for you to save shivs. And then you could also do that with any of the other non-boss enemies within dungeons as well. But you basically get to use shiv a lot more freely and a lot more aggressively. And as long as you have any of these modifiers that we discussed, this can allow shiv to be used pretty freely. There's quite a bit of flexibility and almost no wrong way to use the ability. And as long as you press it on a cooldown, especially in the AoE, for the most part you're going to be doing just fine. Now the actual damage profile of this build is quite different than what I'm used to with Assassination, which generally has very strong single target damage, and that single target can splash onto nearby foes. This build is a bit of a reverse of it. It does suffer in pure single target encounters, so your boss damage for the most part is naturally going to be lower. In fact, when I try to sim this build, this one actually is very difficult to sim over for single target. It works in AoE, but it doesn't really do well in single target whatsoever. Might be missing a couple of modifiers or potentially some context when to run a sim properly. So if you sim it and you get really low numbers, it may actually not do that low in terms of your pure single target output, however. This build, however, does, while lose single target damage, gains a ton of AoE damage that isn't really cooldown reliant. Normally, Assassination would do a ton of damage during the Kingsbane and Deathmark windows to deal a good single target that splashes onto everything around you. This build passively deals a lot of AoE damage even when those cooldowns are not available. And it's not uncommon to go into a trash pack of, I don't know, a bunch of mobs and do like 12 million damage without popping a single cooldown. It is that ridiculous as long as you're really good at spreading your bleeds to multiple targets. That's where a lot of the damage is going to come out of, is being really rigorous with spreading bleeds to every target around you while building up your tier set bonus in order to amplify the damage even further. So it has really high sustained AoE damage. Whether you're fighting a bunch of enemies and doing like target cap or target uncapped big AoE and massive pulls, or if you're doing smaller like cleave, almost council style pulls, pulling 3 or 4 mobs at a time, as long as you're able to bleed all of them up with your Crimson Tempest, Ruptures, and then continue on with Envenoms. Whenever you don't need to refresh your bleeds, a lot of the damage is actually very solid and kind of competitive. Specifically, I had quite a bit of success with this build in places like Motherlode, Priory, Darkfilm Cleft, Cinderbrew Meadery. Floodgate is also a decent option. Rookery can kind of be okay with some decent pulls there. Theater and Mechagon, it does slow down a little bit, but not by much. Those dungeons are just not as heavily packed or dense with mobs, so your damage overall is going to be a little bit lower in comparison to like Cinderbrew, for instance, where you can do some really nasty big pulls. But at the end of the day, the damage does level out, and it's actually kind of nice because it's not super cooldown reliant, which is something I usually feel like, depending on the tank, depending on the group that I'm running with, sometimes I find myself desyncing Kingsbane and Deathmark just a little bit, mostly because there's a bit more travel time between trash pack when I'm running with one tank but not with the other, so then cooldowns kind of become misaligned and I have to wait for them to sync back up together. This build doesn't have to worry about that at all. You're kind of always doing damage, either really, really high in AoE or somewhat kind of middling at times in single target without good procs or without good cooldowns like Deathmark being available. But the overall damage for the dungeon is surprisingly good, especially for the effort that it takes. I would say this build is actually a little bit easier to play than your proper Kingsbane Assassination Rogue. With it being not as cooldown heavy, it's all about maintaining and managing bleeds on targets, just from an assassination into what I would describe essentially as kind of like an Affliction Warlock, but with daggers, which is a super, super fun playstyle that allows you to really dive deep into this whole bleed-focused gameplay of Assassination, which I've always loved. I love the thematic builds of like pure poison or pure bleeds, and this one really does allow you to maximize that bleed damage by quite a decent bit. I definitely recommend you to give this build a go, especially if you're someone who's been playing Assassination Rogue for a while and is looking for something new, fresh, and exciting. But with that, as always, I do want to thank all of you guys so much for watching this guide video, or I guess showcase video, not really a proper guide. Check out our Discord channel down in the description if you want to get a proper guide for Assassination 4 Season 2 with this build, talents, as well as the adjustments rotationally for you to keep up with. Also, as always, if you guys enjoyed this video or found it informative, go ahead and give it a like. I would very much appreciated. Join our Discord community to get access to the guide, but also to discuss any new class changes or patch notes with the community. Let me know all your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.